Before the first tank rolled across Poland, before the Blitzkrieg even had a name, there was already a quiet war, a war of materials. Because to wage war in the 20th century, you didn't just need courage or guns, you needed rubber. The wheels of war literally depended on it.
In 1939, Germany had the best engineers, the most disciplined army, and what many believed was the greatest industrial machine in Europe. But it had one fatal flaw. It had no rubber of its own.
Natural rubber came from the tropics, from British Malaya, from the Dutch East Indies, and from French Indochina, all of them controlled by Germany's future enemies. The Reich had already been cut off once before, during the First World War, and Hitler, who still remembered the humiliation of 1918, swore he would never allow it to happen again. Never again would Germany's war machines stop because of missing materials.
So, even before the invasion of Poland, Göring's 4-year plan demanded a revolution in synthetic materials. Coal must become gasoline, nitrogen must become fertilizer, and oil must become rubber. The future of Blitzkrieg, the very idea of fast mechanized warfare, rested on a chemical miracle that did not yet exist.
Across the Rhine, in the laboratories of IG Farben, teams of scientists were already experimenting with new polymers, strange, stretchy substances they called Buna. Bu from butadiene, Na from sodium, and together they promised a synthetic substitute for rubber. It was a dream of pure alchemy, turning gas and coal into the very lifeblood of modern war.
In 1939, the first Buna factory opened in Skopau. Hitler himself called it a triumph of German science, and for a moment it seemed to work. But the war that was about to begin would demand more than science could give. When the German tanks rolled into France in 1940, every Panzer, every truck, every aircraft tire relied on a thin layer of rubber. And already, the stockpiles were shrinking. The Blitzkrieg was burning rubber faster than Germany could ever replace it.
Deep inside the Ministry of Armaments, reports began to arrive. Shortages of tires, cracked seals, failing hoses. The Luftwaffe grounded dozens of aircraft for lack of replacement parts. The Wehrmacht began rationing. Even the SS received priority quotas for vehicle tires. By late 1940, the Führer's mechanized dream was already running out of rubber.
Yet, at the same time, Germany's victories gave the illusion of invincibility. France had fallen. Norway was under control. The Balkans next. On paper, the Reich seemed unstoppable. But in secret reports to Göring, industrialists warned that unless Buna production could triple, the entire mobility of the German army would collapse within 2 years. Hitler's empire was already winning too fast for its own supply chain to keep up.
Imagine you're a young chemist in 1940, standing in front of a chalkboard at IG Farben. You're told the fate of the war depends on what you can make in a beaker. You have no choice. You mix, you test, you fail. You start again. The generals want tires, the party wants results, and every failure means another tank sits idle, another plane grounded. By 1941, with Operation Barbarossa on the horizon, Germany's fuel and rubber situation had reached the edge of crisis. But the generals ignored it. The scientists kept promising, Buna will save us. No one yet realized that the war they were fighting, the war of tanks, trucks, and steel, would soon be lost not on the battlefield, but in the chemistry lab. And so, as 1941 dawned,
Hitler's armies stood ready to invade the Soviet Union, confident in their machines of war. But their greatest weakness was already rolling with them. Every tire, every gasket, every thread of rubber. A reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape the limits of the materials it depends on.
Before a single tank ever rolled, Germany's war machine was already experimenting with something stranger than steel. Not a weapon, a material. In the laboratories of IG Farben, men in white coats were ordered to bring alchemy to life. Their mission? To turn coal and air into rubber.
The chemical formula was deceptively simple. Take butadiene, bond it with styrene, and out would come a soft, elastic polymer. They called it Buna-S. The Bu from butadiene, the Na from sodium, their catalyst. Together, a promise. Germany could free itself forever from reliance on foreign plantations. It sounded like science fiction, synthetic rubber born from smoke and chemistry. And on paper, it was nothing short of genius. But genius alone doesn't feed an empire. What Berlin needed was tons, not test tubes.
In 1936, a pilot plant in Schkopau had proven the concept. By 1939, Hitler himself held a piece of synthetic rubber in his hand and declared it a miracle of German science. Factories were promised in every industrial region. Reality would prove crueler.
In Schkopau, Löhna, and Meersburg, IG Farben built plants so vast they looked like new cities. Each tower, each pipeline was a temple to this chemical faith. Tens of thousands of workers swarmed inside, engineers, chemists, forced laborers. The Reich was so certain of Buna's success that it began replacing real rubber in military contracts even before mass production was ready. Men in uniform trusted numbers on a spreadsheet more than the reports from the labs.
Meanwhile, a short train ride from Katowice, another project, was breaking ground in a bleak, flat wasteland. It would become the Auschwitz-Monowitz plant, the largest synthetic rubber complex in Europe. For the engineers of IG Farben, it was a dream assignment. For the tens of thousands of conscripted laborers who built it was a sentence. Barracks rose faster than chemical towers. The men inside were worked to death, laying the foundations for the Reich's scientific miracle. The Nazis called it a factory of victory. The prisoners had a different word for it, the Buna Hell.
Otto Ambros, the chief chemist of IG Farben, was one of Germany's great scientific figures. Brilliant, organized, and utterly devoted to the party's industrial vision. He believed chemistry could win the war. But chemistry is not magic. Buna-S was hard to produce purely. The polymers clumped, the mixtures cracked, and the final rubber snapped in the cold.
Reports from the front grew alarming. Tires bursting at freezing temperatures, seals shattering on aircraft engines, and hoses leaking like open wounds. The miracle rubber was failing.
Ambros and his team worked 16 hours a day to find a solution. They changed formulas, pressures, catalysts, everything except the truth. The system itself was the problem. Berlin demanded tons of rubber from plants that barely stood on their own foundations. Every failure was concealed under layers of propaganda and numbers. On paper, the Reich was still self-sufficient. In practice, its wheels were rotting from within.
At Monowitz, the chimneys were never still. Fuel came by rail from the Upper Silesian coal mines. Labor came from the adjacent camp. Those who collapsed were replaced by the next trainload from Birkenau. For the German engineers, production figures mattered more than the faces beneath the helmets. The Reich's most advanced technology was being built on its darkest foundation. Even Albert Speer, who visited the plant in 1943, would later admit he sensed that a shadow lay over the factory. Years later, at Nuremberg, he called it the moment he realized that Germany's science had become a slave to its politics. The synthetic rubber factories of the Third Reich were monuments to both genius and guilt. By the end of 1942, after enormous expense and countless lives, Germany had produced its first 1,000 tons of Buna-S. It was less than 1/10 of what the Wehrmacht consumed each month. 1/10. And the quality was so poor, so unstable, that batches were quietly discarded or burned to avoid embarrassment. Speer later confessed, "With the bombers above and the army shrinking, we still believed chemistry could save us." It did not. And soon even the chemists would learn that not every war can be won with a formula.
From the ashes of their laboratories, a truth emerged more terrible than failure. You cannot engineer morality. The Reich had built its Buna dream on coal, blood, and numbers, and each of those would soon run out.
1942, the year of Germany's greatest gamble. From the shores of the Black Sea to the outskirts of Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht unleashed its summer offensive, Case Blue. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks. A tide of steel meant to break the Soviet Union once and for all.
The propaganda reels showed an unstoppable force, Panzers rolling endlessly across the vast sun-scorched steppe. But behind the triumphant images, a quiet, corrosive failure was taking hold. The miracle rubber, Buna-S, was finally reaching the front lines in quantity, and under the brutal test of real-world combat, it began to fall apart.
The first signs of disaster came not with a bang, but with a crack. As the scorching summer of '42 gave way to the freezing winter, German mechanics on the Eastern Front began to notice something strange. The synthetic rubber on their vehicles was behaving unlike anything they had ever seen. In the -30-degree cold of the Russian plains, Buna-S lost its elasticity. It became brittle, like old glass. Tires that looked fine one moment would shatter into pieces the next. Seals meant to hold vital engine fluids would shrink and crack, causing catastrophic leaks. Hoses would stiffen and split, starving engines of fuel and coolant. The wonder of German science was being defeated by the weather.
Imagine the frustration of a Panzer crew, deep inside enemy territory. Their magnificent machine, a fortress of steel and firepower, is perfectly functional. The engine is sound. The gun is ready. But it cannot move. It is immobilized, a 50-ton steel coffin, because the thin rubber rims on its road wheels have disintegrated in the cold. General Winter had found a new ally, not just snow and ice, but the very material Germany had created to conquer it.
Nowhere was this failure more apparent than on Germany's most feared weapon, the Panzer VI, the Tiger. The Tiger tank was an engineering marvel. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank from over a mile away.
Its armor was almost impenetrable. But it was also a complex, overweight beast, and it was utterly dependent on rubber.
The Tiger's complex suspension system used massive interleaved road wheels, each one fitted with a thick rubber rim to absorb the shock of its 57-ton weight. Without these rubber cushions, the steel-on-steel contact would destroy the tracks and suspension in minutes. Reports from the newly formed heavy Panzer battalions were alarming. Mechanics wrote that the Buna-S wheel rims would wear down, tear, and chunk away at an astonishing rate. A Tiger's road wheels, which were supposed to last for hundreds of kilometers, were sometimes failing after less than 50. Germany had built the most powerful tank in the world, and it was being slowly ground to a halt by its own tires.
The problem went deeper. Every seal in the Tiger's powerful Maybach engine, every gasket in its hydraulic turret traverse system, was now made of this inferior synthetic rubber. Oil and hydraulic fluid leaks became chronic. Engine fires became terrifyingly common. The greatest predator on the battlefield had an Achilles heel made of Buna. And its enemies were beginning to notice.
The true story of the rubber crisis wasn't written in the high command strategic plants. It was written in the greasy, freezing cold maintenance depots just behind the front lines. Here, entire workshops were filled with immobilized vehicles. Panzer IVs, Stug assault guns, half-tracks, all waiting for simple rubber parts that did not exist.
The supply chain was broken. Factories back in Germany couldn't produce Buna fast enough, and what they did produce was often defective. So mechanics were forced to resort to a desperate practice: cannibalization. They would strip the rubber hoses, seals, and wheel rims from one damaged tank to get another one running. Entire vehicles were sacrificed to keep a handful of others in the fight. The depots became graveyards of steel skeletons, picked clean of their rubber flesh.
Official Wehrmacht maintenance reports from this period, now stored in the German military archives, tell a story of quiet desperation. They don't speak of grand strategy. They speak of perished seals, track failures due to rim collapse, and vehicles non-operational pending rubber parts. It was a lesson written in frozen mud and spilled oil. A tank is only as strong as its weakest component, and for the German Panzer divisions in 1943, that component was rubber. The dream of a self-sufficient war machine had become a logistical nightmare. The alchemy of war had produced a brittle illusion. And as the Red Army prepared its great counter-offensives, thousands of German tanks, trucks, and guns stood silent, waiting for a miracle from the chemistry labs that would never come. Back in Berlin, the full scale of the disaster was beginning to dawn on the one man tasked with keeping the war machine running, Albert Speer. Appointed Minister of Armaments in 1942, Speer was an organizational genius. He saw the German war economy not as a collection of factories, but as a single integrated weapon, and that weapon was sputtering. He read the reports from the front with growing alarm. It wasn't just Buna, it was everything. Steel production was down, ball-bearing factories were being bombed, and the oil fields in Romania were under constant threat. Speer understood that Germany was fighting a new kind of war, a war of production, and it was a war they were beginning to lose.
He flew to the Buna plants at Skopau and Luna, demanding answers. The chemists showed him their formulas. The engineers showed him their blueprints.
They promised that with more resources, more workers, more time, they could solve the quality issues. But time was the one resource the Reich no longer had.
Then, in May of 1944, the Allies launched a new phase of the air war. They shifted their primary target from cities and factories to something far more precise and far more lethal to the German war effort: the synthetic fuel and chemical industry. The very heart of Germany's ability to wage a modern war.
Thousands of B-17s and B-24s, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, began to systematically pound the Buna plants. Luna was hit. Schkopau was hit. The sky over Germany's chemical heartland turned black with smoke and flak. For the first time, the war had come directly to the source of the miracle rubber.
The damage was catastrophic. A single bombing raid could knock a plant offline for weeks. Precision bombing destroyed the complex network of pipes and pressure vessels, turning the factories into twisted mazes of useless steel. The chemists couldn't invent their way out of a 500-pound bomb.
Speer, in his memoirs, described the helplessness. He wrote, "With the destruction of these plants, our technical superiority, which had been our greatest asset, was lost. He knew then that the war of production was over. Allied industrial might, delivered from the air, had finally broken the back of German science. The illusion of self-sufficiency, born in a laboratory, died under a rain of bombs."
By 1944, the consequences of the rubber famine were no longer a hidden crisis for mechanics and logisticians. They were a visible reality on every front. The once feared Wehrmacht was becoming noticeably demechanized. Elite panzer divisions that had stormed across Europe in 1940 were now chronically short of serviceable vehicles.
In their place, the German army began to look more and more like an army from a previous century. Infantry divisions, which were supposed to be motorized, now relied almost entirely on horse-drawn carts to move their supplies and artillery. Over 2.5 million horses were used by the German army during the war, a stark contrast to the fully mechanized image of Nazi propaganda. Bicycle battalions became a common sight, tasked with reconnaissance and patrol duties once performed by armored cars.
The irony was crushing. As Germany's mobility collapsed, the Allies was reaching its peak. When American and British forces landed in Normandy, they brought with them an overwhelming logistical advantage. The beaches were flooded with endless columns of American GMC trucks and Jeeps, all fitted with high-quality, durable rubber tires produced by the industrial might of the United States. While German tanks sat idle waiting for a single rubber seal, the Allies were running the Red Ball Express, a non-stop conveyor belt of trucks that kept their armies supplied as they raced across France. Their mobility wasn't a fragile miracle based on a flawed synthetic material. It was a brute force reality based on an endless supply of real rubber and reliable machines.
A German general captured in Normandy, when asked what the single biggest difference was between the two armies, did not mention tanks or planes. He simply said, "You have the trucks, we do not."
The war had come full circle. The Blitzkrieg, a strategy founded on speed and mechanical shock, was defeated by an army that had simply mastered the basics of industrial warfare, the ability to keep its wheels turning. When the war finally ended, the ruins of the Buna factories stood as silent monuments to a grand and terrible ambition. The Auschwitz-Monowitz plant, which had cost countless lives and over 1 billion Reichsmarks to build, never produced a single pound of commercially viable rubber for the war effort. It was a cathedral of failure.
In the years that followed, the men responsible for this alchemy of war faced their own reckoning. At the Nuremberg trials, Otto Ambros, the brilliant chemist behind Buna-S, was tried and convicted for his use of slave labor at Auschwitz. He defended his work as a patriotic duty, a scientific necessity. The court saw it as a crime against humanity.
Albert Speer, sitting in his cell at Spandau prison, spent 20 years writing his memoirs, trying to understand where it all went wrong. He wrote of the hubris, the belief that German science and will could overcome any material obstacle. He admitted that the synthetic rubber program was one of the Reich's greatest industrial illusions, a promise that could never be kept.
The story of Buna-S is more than a footnote in military history. It is a cautionary tale. It reveals how even the most advanced war machine can be brought to its knees by the failure of a single, humble material. It shows that a nation's strength is not just measured in the power of its weapons, but in the resilience of its supply chains and the morality of its methods.
The Third Reich believed it could engineer a new world. It built tanks of terrifying power and planes of incredible speed. But it forgot a simple truth, written in the cracked and brittle rubber that littered the battlefields of Europe. A tank without rubber, like an ambition without a conscience, will not travel far.